to our live audience here. This is the second indoor meeting that we've done, and at the same time we're projecting this on the big screen. So that's up there. Welcome to you at home. Our Rutland Group meet once a month during the winter, like a lot of other members groups. So we're very pleased that this is we just started our new season in this hybrid form. Tonight we very warmly welcome Sarah Lambert, who's the botany recorder for Lincolnshire, and Sarah's very good. She's actually zooming from home, so that's going to be interesting how that works. Well, I know it will because we've tested it enough times now. But Sarah's going to talk about, her title is Changing Flora, Changing Management, Changing Attitudes, and it's botanical thoughts really from Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah now, and we'll catch up later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I'm now going to try and share my screen. So let's see. I've just got to wait for. Just having a slight problem because the bit at the top of Zoom is covering up the bit that I need to press to actually play the slideshow. So. Right, we'll resume the slideshow. Here we go. Right, so yes, Anthony's given me a lovely introduction there. My name's Sarah Lambert. I am the BSBI recorder at the moment only for South Lincolnshire, Vice County 53, although I do stray into the northern part of the Vice County. A little bit about me. This is me with some herbarium specimens. I am based in Peterborough. I worked for the Nature Conservancy Council, Natural England, until 1992, and since then I've been a freelance ecological consultant. So in 2012, I was asked by the BSBI to take on the recorder post in South Lincolnshire, and I've been doing that ever since. There is a prospect that I might get more involved in the northern part of the Vice County because we're losing the recorder there, sadly, after a very long residence, and we're sort of looking at how that will be managed. I'm also very involved with sort of local conservation, so I've at various times been involved with the Beds, Cambs and North Hants Wildlife Trust, both by sitting on committees but also doing a lot of survey work for them. I'm also a member of the Langdyke Countryside Trust, which some of you may have come across, who are particularly looking at nature recovery in the John Clare countryside just west of Peterborough. So most of my botanising over the last 35 years has actually taken place in the counties of Cambridgeshire, Huntingdonshire, Northamptonshire and Lincolnshire, and that's really where I'll be talking about tonight. I was going to split the talk broadly into sort of three areas relating to my main areas of interest. So my sort of volunteer work as a BSBI recorder, my professional work as a consultant, and then also work with the Langdyke Trust and the local wildlife trust on sort of nature recovery in the Peterborough area. As far as the BSBI work goes, the years between 2011 and 2019 were very, very much involved with botanical recording for the BSBI Atlas 2020 project. I'm sure some of you will have come across that. Some of you may well have been involved in recording for it, but this is the update of the Millennium Atlas, so 20 years on, looking at how the flora of the United Kingdom and Ireland has changed. A lot of work had to be done. South Lincolnshire is one of the larger vice counties, and sadly up till 2011, 2012, there hadn't been a lot of recent recording in it. But we made very good progress and actually caught up with many of the other vice counties around. And it did really sort of bring home some of the changes that have occurred in the flora of the vice county. over the period of time. I've got a series of little maps that I'm going to show. These are actually from my own MapMate database, and they can give you quite a good impression of the frequency of plants before and after that 2000 deadline. So plants that have been recorded before 2000 but not since are shown as light blue dots. Anything with a blue cross in it has been recorded post 2000. So that's a sort of considered to be a recent record. And obviously, if you've got both of them, that's an old site where the plant's still recorded. I'm going to go through a few species that have changed over that period, one of which is tubular water droplet. It's actually on the UK red list. It's considered to be near threatened, but in England it has a higher status of vulnerable, and this is really because of landscape scale changes in improvement of damp pastures, drainage, all the sort of classic issues that have affected a lot of grassland in lowland England. And you can see that sort of national picture, the English picture, is really reflected in South Lincolnshire. A lot of pre-2000 records scattered quite widely over the county, not in the extreme west, but sort of through the fens and the fen edge and up along the River Welland. But post-2000, really very confined, mostly to sites, either sites of special scientific interest or county wildlife sites. And the main centre of the population is actually around the Baston Fen, Triple SI, Thirlby Fen Slipe area, just on the fen edge. So that's an example of a species that's really declined over the course of time. Many others don't show such a dramatic downward trend, but there's definitely been a decline in their distribution. One of the classic ones is harebell. It is classified as near threatened in England on the England Red List. And you can see again, it is still relatively widespread. The current distribution very much tracks the Lincolnshire limestone, and then up at the northern end of the county on the more sandy soils. But there's also been a lot of losses, and these tend to be around the periphery of its distribution, where conditions aren't quite so suitable for it often. And this is a species that has been, again, affected by grassland loss, but possibly more significantly by changes in grassland management, and in particular issues such as myxomatosis, but also sort of scrub invasion, where sites there aren't the resources to keep them grazed as short as they ideally should be. There have been some good news from the recording. We've been very fortunate in South Lincolnshire that, as well as the BSBI recorders sort of working on the 2020 Atlas, at the same time we've had Owen Mountford and Jonathan Graham working on an Atlas of the Fens for the Fenland area, which is actually a cross-border atlas. It covers the geographical area of the Fens rather than just an individual county. And their work in particular has highlighted how very important the South Lincolnshire Fens are for very many species. So opposite-leaved pondweed is a species that's vulnerable both in the UK and England. A lot of declines. The map on the right sort of shows the national distribution, and you can see that actually the South Lincolnshire area is now one of the key areas in the country for this, and it's very much found along the fen edge, where you get good quality water coming from the limestone into those fen drains. It's often found in quite small drains, so this is a very characteristic site for it. It can be in the bigger drains, but it actually seems to be surviving rather better in these small drains, often fed through the limestone and sometimes the gravels with really good quality water. Another species that actually follows that trend is lesser water plantain, again near threatened in the UK but considered to be vulnerable in England, and that follows a very similar pattern. It's got a very strong population centre in the South Lincolnshire Fens from Spalding north towards Bourne and Sleaford, from Bourne and Spalding north towards Sleaford along that fen edge. As well as sort of looking at overall changes in distribution of plants, we've actually been able to pick up a few sort of interesting tales. One of those is actually Lesser Centauri. You can see from the map that all the pre-2000 records are in the east side of the county, and all the post-2000 records are in the west side. And it does look a bit odd. You sort of wonder what on earth's going on here. Lesser Centauri, it's an annual species, but it seems to have several places that it actually likes to grow. So it's often a coastal species. So certainly up in North Lincolnshire this summer, I saw masses of it along the dunes at Saltfleetby Feddlethorpe, where you're just on that sort of transition between dune and salt marsh. That it likes that. And it particularly likes being trampled. So it's often follows areas where there are footpaths. In Peterborough, it's very much associated with a lot of brick pits, again on sort of damp clay, which is trampled, but also on woodland rides. So in sites like Bedford Purlieus and Monk's Wood, this will grow, particularly in the centre of the rides where there's clay that's compacted. I think prior to my arrival in South Lincolnshire, it had always been considered to be purely a coastal species in Lincolnshire. And although the dots, the pre-2000 dots appear to go inland, they're actually following the river. So it is sort of associated with coastal habitats. But because I had recorded in Cambridgeshire beforehand, I started looking at some of the ancient woodlands in South Lincolnshire, particularly the larger ancient woodlands that are now often managed by the Forestry Commission. And within a couple of years, actually found it growing on that very typical trampled clay in woodland rides. And since then, now that people know that it exists, they're looking for it, and we've added a few extra records. Still a rarity in the county, but you know, it's again, sometimes you just don't expect to find things. If you don't expect to find things, you don't actually look for them. Another rather peculiar finding from the recording was Fragrant Agrimony. This is a plant very much with a southern distribution in the UK. And I think there'd been one record from North Lincolnshire, sort of an oddity, but it hadn't been recorded in South Lincolnshire until 2014, when 3 different people found it in 3 different Forestry Commission woodlands. Again, it's a bit unclear as to whether it was just the increase in recording and bringing different people in, more pairs of eyes that spotted the difference. Again, maybe nobody was expecting it to be there and nobody was looking out for it. But it's also interesting that it is associated with these Forestry Commission woodlands, and maybe it is actually being carried around by their machinery or by workmen's clothes. Who knows? Just a few more maps showing sort of the changes that have been observed. The last 3 species that I'm particularly going to look at, the changes that have been observed can all potentially be related to climate change, and in particular the milder winters that we have, but are also probably involved with man's intervention as well. So pendulous sedge, probably very familiar to you. It's a native species. When I first moved up to Cambridgeshire in 1985, it was very much a species of streams in ancient woodlands, and it was considered to be quite unusual in some areas. It's been brought into gardens. It's quite an ornamental plant, and it has been brought into gardens, and that can explain some of the spread. But you can see there were very few records sort of pre-2000 in South Lincolnshire, and they would have been confined to those sort of native woodlands. And now most villages have pendulous sedge in it. So as well as actually being brought into gardens, there is a feeling that it's actually responding to climate change because it is a winter evergreen species, and it can carry on growing for much longer than it would have done before when winters were colder, and that's given it a bit of a competitive edge and enabled it to spread much more widely. There are other species that has sort of seemed to show a similar response. Things like Italian lords and ladies, that was a very rare plant sort of pre-2000, but that's becoming established. And another species, a Mediterranean species that is leafy during the winter period and can form quite extensive stands. Another species, one is considered to be an Archaeophyte. So Archaeophytes are species that have been in the UK for some considerable time, but were introduced often by the Romans as part of sort of agriculture spreading from the Mediterranean. It's another species, it's very frequent in the Mediterranean area, and it has long been established down in the southwest of Britain, in particular, sort of Cornwall and Devon and some of the south coasts. It was a wool alien, so there are sort of various records, casual records of it around, and indeed in South Lincolnshire there was a sort of pre-1970 record of the species, but then that was the only record until 2013, when it was picked up by Owen Mountford on a road verge. And it's possible that it's a sort of seed contaminant maybe in road verges, but it's now spreading through the county, not absolutely, not really, really frequent, but it's very widespread. But nearly all the sites where it grows, they do tend to be verges that are south facing or in sheltered conditions in towns and urban areas. So it still sort of needs a little bit of help, but again, it's probably responding to the fact that we do have much milder winters. This photograph that was taken was actually taken in December. It quite often flowers through the winter and is much easier to find in those winter and early spring months often than later on in the summer, when it will shrivel up and is just existing as seed. Another species that seems to be on the spread in particular, this is a neophyte. This is walnut. In fact, it has been in the country for a long time. I think the Romans first brought it in, but it was very much only found in cultivation. And the first record of it as a sort of an established species, I think it was in the sort of 17th, 18th century. So it's been around for quite a long time. But in recent years, again, you can see there was a scatter of pre-2000 records. Some places it's been recorded in both pre-2000 and post-2000, but there's been an awful lot of places where it's only been found since 2000. Now, part of that, again, is probably thanks to the Fenland flora, because they've looked much more closely at the whole of that Fenland area, which admittedly, historically, hasn't been well recorded. So those may have been there for some considerable time, but it does genuinely seem to be spreading. And both in my sort of recording work and professional work, I'm increasingly finding walnut seedlings and saplings and even mature trees in a variety of sites. Barnet Hills and Holes now has a number of walnuts, and I have suggested to Natural England they might want to keep an eye on them, because apparently I managed to find a paper about walnut, and in its native area, which is in Southeast Europe, is not actually doing terribly well. It's on the decline down there. But as climate change is kicking in areas of Northwest Europe, mainland Europe, it is actually becoming an invasive species. Again, the balance has tipped and it's really taking off. So it's one to watch for the future. Now, clearly, I couldn't have done all the recording myself because I was also have to spend time earning a living, sadly. So one of the very early things I did when I became the SBI Recorder of South Lincolnshire was to set up the South Lincolnshire Flora Group. And initially it was a fairly small group, but we arranged field meetings, so running regular field meetings from March to September, usually monthly. Initially they were somewhat ad hoc, and we would arrange them sort of by email, etc. But as the group grew, we became a little bit more structured. We use Facebook. We have a South Links Flora Group Facebook page, and that, together with email, is used to advertise the field meetings, and also we use Facebook to write up the reports so that everybody who perhaps couldn't make it knows what we've found. We've actually found it a really useful means of communication. I have very mixed feelings about Facebook. I'm sure many of you do, but it has been quite a useful means of communication, particularly over the last 18 months. We've used it for skills development, so it's very handy to sort of encourage people to look at groups. You can link to sort of existing information. You can suggest where people might go and look for particular species. So that's been very helpful. When people identify things and they're rather stumped by them, they can actually post those up on Facebook and get an input from all the members. And we are lucky in South Lincolnshire. We have a range of good botanists, and some, such as Owen Mountford, who is extremely good, and he botanizes a lot in Romania as well, so he has a very broad knowledge of European flora as well, and that can really support younger or more novice botanists. So this one was actually nearly through all of us. This is actually an intergeneric hybrid that was found growing in Spalding Cemetery, and that one took a lot of sort of tracking down, but we did manage to find that it was something called Chitalpa, pink dawn. By having the field meetings and using Facebook, we have actually managed to develop quite a vibrant botanical community in South Lincolnshire, which hopefully will sort of really mean that we've got a good basis for recording into the future. So we've been working with the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust as well on a project they did called Love Links Plants, and that was involved with the Natural History Museums, making herbarium specimens for the county. On the left, this was actually a bramble training day that was led by Alex Prendergast, who's the BSBI bramble referee for Eastern England. Not the nicest thing to do, pressing specimens of brambles. They're really very nasty things to have to make herbarium specimens of, but we've had various things like training days like that, and we get involved in more fun activities as well, such as the BSBI New Year plant hunt, where we go to a town or village in the county and record the number of species that are flowering on the 4 days between around New Year. The dates are set by the BSBI. And we've gradually, through all this sort of outreach, we are getting some younger botanists in, because one of the concerns was when we first set up the group, it was quite heavily orientated towards sort of post-retirement people, but we are beginning to get more people in of the younger generation, which is really, really good. So that's a little bit about what I've been doing really, and how the flora seems to be changing. And I could talk for hours on it, but I won't, because that would be terribly boring for you. So I'm just going on to one of my next sort of areas, and this is an area that I've been involved with quite heavily on a professional basis. I mean, I do also obviously record areas of brownfield land as a BSVI recorder, and I'm involved with it through work with the wildlife trusts as well. But brownfield land is one of my sort of favourite places to visit. It's a sort of fascinating, it's not an individual habitat, I've had a fascinating set of habitats, and sometimes stunningly beautiful as well. You can see here, this is quite a typical area of brownfield on land at Whitemoor in North Cambridgeshire, near March in Cambridgeshire. And this is an assemblage of species. We've got vipers, bugloss, perforat St John's wort, weld, mignonette, musk thistle. A really sort of spectacular assemblage of species on these brownfield sites. So brownfield land, and it covers a wide range of types of land, but it's land that has been used for industry in some way previously. So it may be quarrying, it could be an area that's been developed and then abandoned. So there are a sort of whole set of brownfield sites, and obviously they vary incredibly in age. So some will be very recent, have just come out of quarrying perhaps, and others, I mean, you can argue that Barnack Hills and Holes National Nature Reserve is a brownfield site because back in medieval times it was quarried, but obviously that's a very long time ago. Brownfield sites actually seem to are particularly important in the counties of Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire, where so much of the land is really heavily managed, very intensely farmed, lots of inputs of fertilizer, herbicides, etc. Brownfield land is sort of completely different. It's like almost the opposite end of an arable to clay spectrum, because the sites, they are normally very low nutrient content. This is part of the clay pits in Cambridgeshire, and you can see there that after the quarrying, often you are just left with the subsoil. This is the Oxford clay, but in other places it's limestone or sand, but all share that characteristic of having a really low nutrient content. Where you have these very low nutrient sites and they actually hold water as well, that water tends to be very clean. It's often isolated from inputs from sort of rivers, and we've all been hearing about how polluted our rivers are and how much sewage is going into those. They also tend to be isolated from sort of farm ditches, etc. So the water is very clean and low in nutrients. So you often get a really interesting assemblage of wetland plants in them. This is Bladderwort, a species that's often more associated with sort of heathlands and moorland. Again, other low nutrient habitats, but it is present in the Kingsdyke brick pits and a few other areas. You can see the bladders very nicely on that photograph. And Peterborough in particular is of extremely high national importance for the assemblage of stoneworts that are present. Stoneworts are algae, they're complex algae, but they tend to be treated as honorary flowering plants. So BSVI recorders do cover stoneworts, but they're considered to be often the sort of canaries of the wetland habitats, because they do require very good quality water, low in nitrogen, low in phosphorus, but high in calcium, which is what they actually use. They deposit the calcium on the outside of the stems, and that's what gives them sort of, they're quite crunchy and gives the name stonewort. The picture is of hedgehog stonewort, which is actually quite local nationally, but is a very common species of brick pit ponds, such as this one at Kingsdyke. There are even rarer, there are rarer stoneworts here. Peterborough has a significant population of Cara canescens, and I always forget its English name, but that's actually a Schedule 8 protected species. So that's one of our key species in these brownfield sites around Peterborough. One of the other features of many brownfield sites is there tends to be a high proportion of open ground. And this is obviously related to the infertile nature of the substrate. They're usually quite harsh. Often, many of them dry out in the summer, and you get this wonderful sort of mosaic of structure that you can see in the photograph. Again, this is back at Whitemoor near March. There's some other interesting species. There's a little bit of white mullein in there, which is well established, but you can see that sort of open structure. And that means that many annual species really thrive on these brownfield sites. And these assemblage of annual species, they're often things that you may find in towns and villages, which we'll come on to. But there are some that are a little bit more discerning, things like early forget-me-not, round-leaved cranesbill, a little bit more restricted in their distributions. But this assemblage of annuals, the fact that you have so many of them, is one of the characteristics of brownfield sites, and is quite reminiscent of some of the sort of vegetation that you might find in the Mediterranean, where you have a lot of species that germinate in the autumn, grow through the winter, flower early in the year, and then are over. So all of those on that slide are fairly common annual species. But there are a whole range of rarer ones that are associated with brownfield sites, particularly in Cambridgeshire. Basil thyme and wild candytuft are both considered to be vulnerable now in England. And at one time, all three of the species, common cudweed is near threatened, but all three of these, they would have been found outside brownfield areas, often on arable margins, particularly where the soils are either sandy or very limey. These would all have been species that would have cropped up there. Now they very rarely occur in the arable communities because they tend to be so loaded with nutrients, and then herbicides are used, and they found refuges in these brownfield areas. Another particular feature of brownfield sites is they're quite often imported materials in some of them. So they have varied substrates and often varied topography as well. I keep coming back to Whitemoor, partly because I've spent over 15 years monitoring it and looking at it, the changes in its vegetation over that period. And this is an area where there's a lot of concrete still present. All the sort of green that you can see is white stonecrop. There's also biting stonecrop in there, sort of these very almost like cliff-loving plants that are present. But you get that with a sort of an interesting set of non-natives as well. So narrow-leaved ragwort is also very abundant in this area. But this range of sort of different substrates means that you actually get plants that are generally rare in an area, but can thrive because there's a little pockets of different substrates. So Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire generally are really quite base-rich counties. They sort of have chalk and limestone and boulder clay. All of these are sort of high in calcium. There's not many areas of acid conditions within them. But these brownfield areas, often acid conditions do develop because of the past sort of treatment. So on railway areas, it's often the substrate starts off very alkaline but leaches very quickly. In other areas, it might be that they've been used for the calcining, which is part of the sort of lime process and produces these more acidic deposits. So you locally get things like sheep's sorrel, changing forget-me-not, and bird's foot that are really otherwise very rare in the area. These very low fertility sites and open sites, they also have often associated lichens and mosses that you don't tend to find very widely elsewhere. And these are sort of species that you perhaps more often associate with heathland conditions or very, very sort of poor chalk grassland, poor in nutrients rather than anything else. Another feature of these brownfield sites is that they tend quite often not to have any management, and that's a mixed blessing. If the substrates are sufficiently infertile and you have good populations of rabbits and sometimes deer as well, the assemblages can be relatively long-lasting. The conditions are so hard that it sometimes deters scrub and all the other things that are such a problem in many conservation sites. But for most brownfield sites, eventually there is a sort of build-up of fertility and you will start getting scrub invasion. You can see here, locally, there's a really lovely open structured sward, lots of little annual species and some rarities along the edges of a track. But in other areas, a lot more scrub has come in, rank grassland, etc. At Whitemoor and Conington, we've been trying to sort of hold back the succession by managing through cutting. So initially cuttings in May and September, and then in more recent years, mostly at the end of the year, as the vegetation got somewhat under control. But one of the problems, if you carry on doing that, oh, I forgot about this one. This slide is just showing how lack of management also means that many biennial species and tall species, they do get a chance to flower, and then the seeds and the flower stems are retained right through the year, which is very, very good for invertebrates, and also just quite stunning again. But yes, if you actually sort of go for more of a cutting regime, because quite often it's not feasible to bring grazing animals on some of these sites, particularly ones that are either on sort of toxic, potentially toxic soils, or close to railway lines where fencing would be prohibitively costly, you eventually end up with a much more grassy sward. So on this slide, you can see on the right hand side quite a dense sward, a lot of wood small reed coming in there, still quite a varied flora, but you're losing that open structure that is so interesting on the brownfield habitats. This is where changing management sort of comes into the talk, because it has taken some time to persuade Network Rail to actually put money into taking back the succession by scraping off all the sort of a few centimetres of the topsoil. But a couple of years ago, they actually did this, and you can see the difference. This is in the second year. So the first year looked quite dramatic, but already things like common cudweed were coming in. And you can see in the second year, you've got, again, that more varied flora and more varied structure. How long this will last, I don't know, because bramble is one of the biggest issues on these sorts of sites, and particularly some of the low-growing railway brambles. But for brownfield sites, quite often this sort of large-scale setting back the succession is a better way of managing them than actually trying to keep things ticking over. The Wildlife Trust, the Beds and Cans Wildlife Trust, are also using this sort of approach on one of their sites. This is Old Salhay Nature Reserve, which many of you might have visited, not far from Rutland. Really lovely mix of habitats. So it has got brownfield components, which are associated with the ironstone extraction industry, but there are also areas of ancient woodland, established woodland. And here you can see in the background, you've got quite a lot of birch, and this is one of the colonizing species that tends to come into the many brownfield sites. on the right-hand side of the slide, there is established woodland, which has birch in it, but also oak. In the foreground, there's an area that's been cleared very recently. So that was about 6 months after it had been cleared. So the trust basically got a bulldozer in to clear back to the limestone. Before this slide was taken, there was quite a lot of young birch there. And this has been particularly done for the flora, so things like the basil thyme that's quite frequent there, and some of the other little annual rarities, but also to try and encourage some of the lower growing species, the little annual geraniums for butterflies, and things like the wild strawberry for grizzled skippers. So definitely a sort of an interesting way to manage these brownfield sites that don't really respond to perhaps more traditional agricultural management techniques. Another area that I've been involved in, both through recording in Lincolnshire. Many of you might have heard of the Lincolnshire Verges project that was carried out a few years ago, but also more recently in the Peterborough area is the resource that road verges represent. They can be sort of really important areas botanically. This is a lovely road verge at South Witham, a nature reserve of the Lincs Wildlife Trust. And you can see this nice stand of common spotted orchids and a range of other limestone species. And this is managed sympathetically. It is cut annually and all the cuttings are removed. And the limestone is quite close to the surface here. We've got a limestone cutting, so you haven't got a big depth of topsoil, and that really helps with keeping this diverse flora. Sadly, in Peterborough, we at one time we had some amazing road verges, and there are some records of some really sort of interesting species being present historically, particularly associated with sort of intense rabbit grazing. But a combination of lack of rabbits, increasing quantities of nitrogen in the atmosphere, both from traffic and from sort of agricultural operations. They've sort of affected the verges, climate change as well, probably, because the grass is tending to grow throughout the winter, in many winters, and many of the protected verges, the county wildlife site quality verges in the Peterborough district, have gone downhill sort of in the last 20 years. This is a fairly typical piece of verge, quite close to Castor Hanglands National Nature Reserve. And you can see there are interesting bits of flora in it. There's common knapweed there. I think there's a bit of ragwort further on. But most of the verge is actually dominated by false oak grass, which is really responding to sort of a lack of management. False oak grass really thrives when management is either absent or relatively light. And you can also see a lot of suckering blackthorn coming into that verge. Now that verge is potentially recoverable. Some are even worse. So this is actually up on the limestone near Barnack, but a very sort of nutrient enriched verge, lots of hedge bindweed, really very few herbs in it at all. This is, as I say, one of the county wildlife site verges, and at the moment it's really not fulfilling its potential. As a result of sort of observing this, Langdyke Trust and the John Clare Countryside Project actually started up a group to involve the City Council in trying to actually improve management of the road verges. This is a sort of long-term project because, having sort of got involved, there are many issues that affect the verges, things like lack of suitable equipment, obviously lack of money, entrenched contracts that are difficult to change. It's not very easy, but as a start, Peterborough City Council actually tried cutting 2 trial verges in the spring this year to see whether adding an extra cut in spring to sort of remove the tall grass that accumulates between the sort of cut in autumn and by April, to see whether that would actually help improve the quality of the flora. So most of these county wildlife site verges, they are only cut once a year, sort of in September, and this might have been adequate when it was first suggested, but it really isn't under the current conditions. Sadly, this year, April was the coldest that we've had for many years, and there wasn't a lot of winter growth. So we haven't really been able to sort of pick up any effects, and we wouldn't expect to in a year. But it has enabled us to again get local people involved. So with the Wildlife Trust for Beds and Cans, we've actually got groups out monitoring the road verges, actually doing structured walks and trying to actually get some data following the JNCC's rapid survey technique that's somewhat adapted, so that we can actually see how the management is affecting some of these. I'm not sure whether our trial projects will continue, because actually as a result of our involvement, Peterborough City Council actually managed to get quite a decent sum of money through biodiversity offsetting. So they're now looking at actually changing the management, probably cutting twice a year on most of the county wildlife site verges rather than just the 2 trial verges. But that will also take some sort of consideration, because these were cut to say in April and then in September. But some areas, the verges in the Peterborough area, they actually have very good early floras, wood edge floras. So we need to sort of come up with a programme where there are different managements tailored to each verge. That's not always going to be easy, because I'd say local authorities tend to like things simple. This is just an example I've thrown in of a Lincolnshire verge, and this is a very nice one that's small scabious growing, and you can see lady's bed straw in there. A really good range of species. This was actually visited in August, and I just put this in because this is one that the farmer manages, and he cuts it for hay sort of in June, July. One of the problems, I think people sort of understand a lot about sort of how verges do provide a really good resource, but quite often messages that come across, even from conservation organisations, can be quite sort of almost a little bit simplistic, because you want to sort of make things easy for people to understand. And one of the general sort of things that's come across is that you shouldn't cut your verges when they're flowering, because it will sort of damage, it cuts off all sort of pollen and nectar sources for insects. All these things are true, but actually for many plants, particularly those that are lower growing, having that cut sort of between the end of May and the sort of traditional hay cutting time of sort of end of June, mid-July, is what enables them to survive, because that's the point where you're taking the maximum nutrients out of the system. And if you leave your verges till late summer, most of the nutrients in those grasses have gone back into the roots and back into the soil. The idea really should be to try and get a patchwork, so that you've actually got some areas that are being cut perhaps in the summer, and you can see that if you have those areas that are cut in summer, by the time you get to late summer in August, you've got another flush of flowers that you wouldn't normally have had. You can just about see in the background on the other side of the verge, that's not been cut at all. During the summer, you can see the vegetation's largely turned brown. There aren't many flowers over there. So trying to aim to get this sort of patchwork effect with different cuts in different places is really how we're going to try and certainly proceed in Peterborough. But I say there are difficulties in achieving that. The Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust, again, looking at sort of changing attitudes and changing the way that verges are managed. They've actually worked with industry, with the agricultural industry, to develop a bespoke verge harvester, which I've not seen in action. But basically this is a flail mower, but it's actually sucking up the cuttings. So again, they're not left to lie and enrich vegetation, and that's being used for anaerobic digestion. There are potential issues with that, the effects on invertebrate populations, for example, and Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust certainly aren't using that method on the best quality verges, where sort of hay cutting or timed cutting by the trust itself is always preferred, but it's probably a better way of managing many of the other sort of slightly second tier verges than the current management, which tends to be flailing and just leaving all the cuttings on the verge to rot down and enrich it, which then sort of reduces the diversity even more. Verges lead into villages. I was brought up in an urban area. I was actually brought up in Romford in Essex, pretty urban. My first job was in East London, looking at urban flora. So again, urban vegetation has always been very close to my heart. When doing the BSVI recording in South Lincolnshire, I made sure that we actually included the villages. And again, we found lots of extra species and records of interesting species because it had been an under-recorded area. Lots of people sort of seem to see a very sort of definite divide between the nature reserves, the semi-natural habitats, and those habitats that are actually very man-made. But in fact, the urban habitat, a lot of the species are their native species, and what we are producing in our, particularly in Lincolnshire and around Peterborough, where the limestone is widely used for walls and buildings, we're basically producing little cliffs, artificial cliffs. And you can see here, this is actually a monument in Bainton, and it's covered with black spleenwort, which you can't really pick out very well, and other ferns, as well as mosses. And that's one of the things, these small ferns really are sort of an important component of the urban area and really don't occur outside those urban areas. So here we've got maidenhair, spleenwort and woolrue. So they're very characteristic of the urban area. There are some rarities that are actually associated with walls and villages. So just north of Stamford, in the village of Carlby, there's an extremely large population of wall pennywort. Now, if you're anywhere in sort of south and western England, that's not a rarity. It's really, something that you would expect to find. But in Lincolnshire, this is probably the only well-established population. Whether it's native or not, it's difficult to know. It may well be that somebody brought it in as a garden plant, planted it on their wall. But for some reason, the village of Colby, it seems to find the Blisworth limestone sort of perfect. It's quite sheltered. And it is possible that it's actually a relict, because if you actually look back into the records in the 17th and 18th century, wall pennyworts seem to be much more frequent in eastern England. It's not entirely clear why it's disappeared so thoroughly, but there are records of it as sort of around the Peterborough area, and maybe this is a relict. So these urban areas can throw up some quite interesting records. They're also very good, like the brownfield sites, for species that are sort of have a somewhat Mediterranean centre of distribution, the winter annuals, things like common whitlow grass and rue-leaved saxifrage. Interestingly, rue-leaved saxifrage may well be responding to the changes associated with climate change. It was, when I first came up to Peterborough, it really was considered quite a rarity, and it was in the Cambridgeshire Red Data Book as a rare plant at that time, but it seems to be increasing quite considerably and is quite happy on walls and in gutters and pavements, doing really very well. One of the most important areas in many villages and urban settings are the churchyards, often because they contain fragments of ancient grass, some of the most ancient grassland in the parishes, the areas that haven't had fertiliser or herbicide poured over them. Around Peterborough, one of the very sort of interesting plants associated with churchyards is Hoary Plantain, and this is true actually for the whole of Lincolnshire and probably anywhere in eastern England where you've got limestone. So Hoary Plantain, still a widespread species, but in the red list for England, it's considered to be near threatened. And really this is because there's been a lot of losses, I think, particularly on road verges. This is one of those rosette species that once a road verge starts getting rank and tall, or only being cut once a year, it really can't compete. Whereas churchyards that are often mown very neatly is really quite happy there. You can see in the top right, a whole set of rosettes in the lawn of the churchyard. Main problem is it doesn't get that much of a chance to flower, but to be honest, for the Hoary Plantain, they're long-lived, they're perennial. These plants don't need to flower every year, so from their point of view, it's not a problem. It's a shame perhaps for parishioners who won't actually appreciate it. There's a whole set of species that are quite associated with churchyards and cemeteries in Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire, and some of the more interesting ones, meadow saxifrage, that the largest populations that I know of are all in cemeteries or churchyards. So the biggest population in South Lincolnshire is almost certainly in Stanford Cemetery, where there has been management to try and encourage it. So the areas where the meadow saxifrage is particularly abundant they're not cut until it's had a chance to flower and seed. But it's also in Broadway Cemetery in Peterborough and various churchyards as well. Some churchyards have more of a woodland component. So on the bottom left, you can see a population of Goldilocks. This is actually at Uffington Church, and you can see primroses in the background. There are also wood anemones and genuine bluebells there. So probably a little bit of relict ancient woodland that's just hanging on in the churchyard. And pignut is another very frequent churchyard species on some of the slightly more acid to neutral churchyards. Obviously, it's encouraging parishioners to manage the churchyards sensitively. It is a really good way to conserve habitats for these species. But again, you need to know your site. So, you know, if you have a large population of Hoary Plantain, you don't necessarily want to leave all your churchyard to grow long and just cut it at the end of the year. It may be that you want to cycle it so that you're cutting it regularly one year and you leave it, some of it to grow long so that you can actually see the flowers, but then perhaps cut at the end of July to favour that and other species. As well as the some native species in churchyards, they also have some interesting sort of non-native species. So orange hawkweed is a plant that does particularly well in churchyards. I think probably it's in most of the churchyards in South Lincolnshire, and that it's often with mouse-ear hawkweed, which is the native one as well, but orange hawkweed is a little bit more robust and more tolerant of its soils. Stinking iris is an interesting one in churchyards and in villages generally. This is another species that seems to have increased dramatically over the past 20 to 30 years. So I can remember again coming into Cambridgeshire, and this was thought to be quite exciting in a couple of the ancient woodlands. In Lincolnshire, it was only known from Kirby Wood for many years, And now, again, partly because it is grown as a garden plant, but also partly because it just seems to prefer these sort of milder, damper winters. It's in most churchyards and most villages in the area. Just going to coming to an end now, I hope. Yes, I'm slightly over, but I just briefly want to say one of my current crusades is really trying to encourage botanical literacy. And this, I'm not sure quite whether this is quite the right term, but really for many people, plants are almost, they're plant blind. They hardly see the plants that are around them. I'm sure that doesn't apply to all of you and most people in the conservation organisations, but I was trying to imagine what it would be like if I wasn't a botanist. And I've tried to look at a few sort of areas and think, what would I see if I was just seeing it in a very general term? So I've got a couple of bits of turf here, one of which is a semi-improved grassland, quite attractive. It's got lots of autumn hawkbit and some red clover there. On the right is a much more species-rich grassland. This is from a brownfield site, and having done a quadrat here, I know there are over 40 species in that area. So really sort of very rich. I also put in a slide because for many people, this is what they actually think of as being sort of quite a good mix of species for wildlife. These sorts of pollinator mixes, which do have their place, and they're great in gardens and they're great in parks and perhaps more formal areas. Lots of people seem to now equate these with wildflowers, and it's really a tricky thing that lots of botanists are sort of quite concerned about, because they are sort of turning up sometimes in places where they're not appropriate, and trying to sort of encourage people to realise that this is a mix of species, most of which aren't native. They will provide pollen and nectar for a short amount of time, but they're actually not providing anything for invertebrates to breed on. They're really a sort of quick fix, the McDonald's for invertebrates, rather than a good sustaining proper dinner. But I tried looking at them when they're blurred, and I think for a lot of people, the first two, they just do look sort of greenish, and you don't pick out, unless you've actually been trained or are naturally very observant, quite often you sort of don't pick out the differences. There are differences, there's obviously differences in colour and texture, and experienced botanists and ecologists will often use those sorts of differences from a very long way away to sort of work out whether an area of grassland or other habitats worth looking at. But for most people, the third one, where you've actually got those colours still sort of penetrate through, would seem to be more attractive. How we get over that? Well, again, I don't know. It may be that as botanists, we have to sort of think about what is and isn't acceptable in terms of sort of habitat creation, sort of where wildflower seeding should and shouldn't be used. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but if anyone wants to pick it up in the questions, that would be great. But there are species that you now find quite widely on some of these sort of arable margins where they've been planted, things like cornflower and corncockle, that are effectively extinct in the UK as native species, but are now being widely brought back. And to be honest, this sort of planting, it means we don't actually really know quite what's happening with our native flora. But so in some areas, the wildflower seeding can work quite well. So this is an area close to Peterborough, which probably arose from seeding, but again, not very well recorded, so nobody quite knows what the history is. But the bird's foot trefoil in here is all of a subspecies that is actually a European subspecies and not our subspecies, and those are the sorts of things which suggest this is a sort of wildflower mix. It's been present for a long time, but quite nice habitat. how to get over it is really, again, a question of engaging people and trying to sort of show people different types of habitat. And this is where the wildlife trusts are just so good, because they get people out, and we can start doing that. That hopefully that message can spread. I think it's getting it even wider, and social media can do some of that, but actually engaging with parishes and local communities, I think possibly is the way forward, trying to move from perhaps being quite so trust-based into those local areas, getting people to appreciate what's on their doorstep, what's special about their particular villages, and then to respect it and hopefully manage it for the future. That's where I shall be spending a fair amount of my time over the next few years. Thank you for listening. So I'm very happy to take any questions about any botanical matters. Can't promise to answer them though.
Thank you.
I should stop sharing now.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm in the dark because we've still got our lights out here.
Right, okay.
That's excellent. There are one or two questions somewhere down there, which I'll pick up on. One observation which you mentioned towards in the first part of your cracking these lights. On the first part of your talk was interesting because of walnuts, and I wonder, about the effect of climate, maybe the effect of mild winters, but it could be, I suppose, that the walnut seeds are actually germinating and establishing much more efficiently than they used to be. We've also got an awful lot of squirrels, and you can find walnuts growing, in places where a long way from a walnut tree. And
yeah.
The success of the germinating seedling, it looks to be fairly good as well. And so you've got a combination of probably effect of climate, but also an increase in population of squirrels.
But that's right. I mean, I think with all these changes, it's very hard to tease out any individual factor. Usually there are a number of factors that are sort of influencing it. But it's just that we have seen, certainly in from the data in Lincolnshire, and it will be interesting when the BSVI Atlas is published, which hopefully will be next year. They are going to try and look at some of these trends in a more general term, because there do seem to be whole sort of suites of species that are changing in response to climate. But yes, I mean, the walnuts, the germination, I mean, whether again that's to do with soil temperatures. I'm sure squirrels do have a lot to do with it, because they've certainly planted a walnut in our garden. So yes, that's very true.
One question from John here, and it concerns the distribution maps. Are these based on exactly the same sites being recorded? In other words, is the loss of a site, does that indicate that the site was surveyed but the plant was not found?
No. I mean, unfortunately, so for the BSVI Atlas recording, most of it is done by tetrads. So that's 2 by 2 kilometres square. That was the sort of maximum area that you could assign a record to. Ideally, monads are better, individual sites are better still, but because we were covering a very large area, I can't remember exactly how many, I'm useless at numbers, but we have a large area to cover in South Lincolnshire. So no, that you do have to treat these changes with caution, so that in some cases there are some ancient woodlands where it looks like a whole set of ancient woodlands where species were recorded in the 1980s, that those species have been lost, but in fact it was because the landowner didn't give any access permission, so we weren't able to actually verify whether they were present or not. So you do have to sort of generalize with these trends, but mostly, I think the ones I've shown you, that there are definite trends there, but it won't necessarily be an absolute sort of, they've been to the site and it's not present. It's also quite hard actually being sure that things aren't present, because one of the things that doing such concerted recording, which actually involved the whole year as well, we were sort of, I was at least recording right through the winter months, is you realise that some species, they have just such a very short period of time where you can actually record them, whereas others are visible at any time of year. So a lot of the rarities, you do sort of actually start to wonder, how rare are they? Is it just because you can only see them basically for a matter of a month, perhaps out of 12 months, that this is giving a sort of an artificial rarity to them? And that actually, I've picked that up at doing this sort of regular monitoring on some of the railway sites. So the one down at Connington, which is next to the East Coast Main Line, there are species there that I've only picked up once in 15 years. And it's just often because the season's been slightly different, because that has been regularly monitored in May and July over those periods, and the same places have been gone back to. But every year I find new things there. You know, you think you've been around it so thoroughly, but every year there's new things, and quite often it is associated with a year that's perhaps a bit atypical. So yeah, it's very hard to prove that things aren't there anymore, and they can pop up after a long absence, particularly sort of annuals. Annuals are very difficult to monitor.
Thanks. A question from our recorder here, Geoffrey Hall.
I thought Geoffrey might be there.
Have you observed any changes in the distribution of ferns since 2000?
Well, now that is an interesting one. Ferns, in terms of wall ferns, would appear to have got more frequent, but I think that is actually because I've tended to have a bit more focus on the urban and sort of village areas. But it may be a genuine, again, it's really hard to tell, because it may be a genuine sort of phenomenon. If winters are wetter, then that could affect those. Not really noticed any changes in sort of woodland ferns particularly. Again, the only one really is that I think we've recorded the scaly male fern more frequently, but I'm not sure whether that's actually, again, an artifact of having people who can recognise it, because this is another thing that you find with botanical recording. You know, some species, just if they're difficult or in a difficult species complex, most people will not record them or not attempt to record them. But then if you get some good recorders like Owen Mountford in, then suddenly you get extra records because they're confident in their identifications. I'd be interested to know if has Geoffrey found any changes.
I'll have to make a comment in the chat, I think.
Yeah, right, yes.
Any questions from here, from the live audience? I'll repeat it and then everybody can hear.
Yeah, I was the management of the verges, particularly around the Peterborough area. Who approached who? How does it seems very complicated if you different cutting regimes with different verges and different flora on it. So you must have an awful lot of experienced recorders to manage these verges.
So yes, I'm not sure whether you caught any of that, Sarah. Had coping with verge management like you did with Peterborough. How did you manage to do that? Have you got a group of recorders looking regularly so that you can organise the different management regimes for the different areas?
We're still working on that. So basically, this came through the John Clare Countryside Nature Recovery project, which has recently got some funding for people to be in post, but it really, I pushed it. The Wildlife Trust has obviously been quite closely involved with Peterborough City Council in terms of the county wildlife site verges, and they recorded them. And as I say, initially they recommended the management, which was to be for the verges to be cut once a year in September and for those cuttings to be removed. But myself and Margaret Palmer, who used to work for Natural England, particularly had noticed the gradual decline over the last 20 years. So we pushed for a meeting with the City Council to discuss this. And I have to say, the first meeting we had wasn't very positive at all. So we had the actual sort of person who's involved with the environment, the head of the person involved, the head of the environmental part of Peterborough City Council, but all the cutting is actually delegated out to Aragon Services, who are a separate entity. We had their manager there, and we had the person who manages their contract from Peterborough City Council. And I think they probably felt a bit got at. So it was they were very defensive initially. And I really didn't think we would make any progress, but actually I've been coordinating those meetings, and we've got people from quite a lot of parishes where there are sort of interesting road verges involved. So the parishes are involved, the City Council's involved. I'm involved sort of trying to coordinate some of the recording. The Wildlife Trust are involved. So we've got everybody around the table, and actually now is an incredibly useful and productive group, and we are sort of working towards producing these sort of more tailored management plans. And so we're sort of, it's only a year, it's literally 1 year since we started, and these things do take time. This is why I say it's a very much a long-term project, and I don't think we'll see the sort of benefits for 5, possibly 10 years really, but actually getting everybody talking to each other about verges and what you can do with verges. I was also involved with training people. So the surveyors that you saw in the slides, I trained them on a county wildlife site initially off a verge, because there are also lots of safety issues with verges, which makes it even more difficult. And I then sort of supported them through their first runs, but the method that was chosen was relatively sort of straightforward. It looks at indicator species that are relatively easily identified. So they were able to then sort of carry on with that, and they all did really well. I mean, the one thing I completely underestimated was, because I'm a professional botanist, I sort of thought they'd be able to do about 4 times as much as they could. But it quickly became clear to me that, you know, I've been doing it for 35 years. So this was a completely unrealistic expectation on my part, and we tailored it down and we did fewer samples, and, you know, but it's really engaged them. And the other nice thing about doing all this survey on verges was that a surprising number of people stopped and asked what was going on. So it's a really good opportunity to talk to people, including quite a lot of lorry drivers, a surprising number of lorry drivers. Presumably they drive through these verges and sort of see them, but they were sort of really interested. Yeah, so yeah, not easy though. It's really not easy.
It's good. Thank you very much. Jeffrey has just replied to yours, and I'll try and read it for you. I've seen a huge increase in Polystyrchum setiferum since 2000, and a decrease in Aetherium felix femina. Wall ferns are increasing, especially Asplenium ceterarch. The situation is complex, and I think there is more than one environmental driver.
Yeah. Okay, well, yes, Asplenium ceterarch, I think in Lincolnshire we've actually, there have been 1 or 2 new sites, but we've lost more than we've gained. So it seems to be, seems to be more or less stable. Again, I haven't noticed huge changes. Polystichum sativum has been recorded a little more frequently, but it's pretty rare in Lincolnshire, so it's really hard to tell whether there's any trend. Etheirium, actually, I think it went through a stage of being under-recorded, so there were quite a lot of old records, and then it seemed to be absent. And again, I'm not sure whether this was just that there weren't that many people in Lincolnshire that were confident in identifying it, but it's certainly a lot of the old sites, it has been refound, but I'm not sure that I could say one way or another whether there's been a decrease or an increase, really. I would have said that a slight decrease, but possibly not necessarily sort of a significant one, but it's often is just at very low levels. So population wise, this is the main problem with a lot of the sort of botanical, the BSVI recording, is that you're sort of looking largely at distribution, but then going on to look at population levels is another set of work that needs to be done.
Thank you. Well, I think that just about winds up. We've got no more questions on there, I don't think. No, I think that covers it. Sarah, that's been great. Your title was Changing Flora, Changing Management and Changing Attitudes, and I think that was very clear. I think it gave us a really good overview of all of those particular subjects, focusing on, you know, a relatively few species, but nevertheless very interesting ones. And I just join in everybody here, and I can say that for Rutland Group members regularly, the system works. So come on to our next and swell the live audience. But thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Sarah. It's been great.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
You are a Strictly Come Dancing cheer.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, Anthony, and everyone at the Rutland Group for organising this evening's talk, and thank you to everyone who's joined us online. It's been a fantastic evening. Don't forget to come to our next online talk, and I always forget every time to check what it is. I can't remember, but please do head to our website, and then we've got a couple more coming up before the end of the year, and we hope to see you there. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Sarah, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.